Hello, everyone, and welcome to Nature Connects. Nature Connects is the Massachusetts TNC webinar series that connects you with scientists and nature experts from New England and around the world. Thanks for joining us. We've got a big audience today. Welcome to the folks who've joined us via Zoom, and a special hello to those of you on Facebook Live. I'm Massachusetts State Director and your host, Deb Markowitz. Over the next hour, we'll be engaging in an exciting and important conversation about advancing climate action over the next decade. We're joined by author Fred Rich and TNC's Chief External Affairs Officer, Lynn Scarlett. They'll kick us off with a discussion about the need for bipartisan dialogue and support for meaningful action on climate change and sustainability. At the Nature Conservancy, we know that nature plays a critical role in sustaining our health, our livelihoods, and our well-being. We also know that we need a diversity of voices at the table who understand and value the protective power of nature. Without that, it'll be hard to accomplish the changes that must happen to ensure the planet is livable into the future. Lynn and Fred will present for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have a moderated discussion and take some audience questions. So first, let me introduce Lynn and Fred. Lynn Scarlett is Chief External Affairs Officer at the Nature Conservancy. In this role, she influences climate and conservation policy in the United States and the 79 countries and territories in which TNC operates. And with our corporate engagement team, Lynn advances private sector partnerships to support sustainability and enhance ambitious action to address climate change. Prior to her role at the Conservancy, Lynn was Deputy Secretary and Chief Operating Officer at the U.S. Department of Interior, where she also served as Acting Secretary in 2006. While Deputy Secretary, Lynn initiated and chaired the department's Cooperative Conservation Working Group and its first ever climate change task force. She established the Interior Department's Ocean and Coastal Activities Office and chaired the Federal Wildland Fire Leadership Council. Lynn also served on the Executive Committee of the President's Management Council and co-chaired the First Lady's Preserve America initiative. Lynn has written on climate change adaptation, ecosystem services, large landscape conservation, and science and decision-making. She was a co-convening lead author of the 2014 National Climate Assessment. Lynn chaired the Science Advisory Board of NOAA from 2014 to 2020, and she is a member of the National Academy of Sciences Sustainability Roundtable. Now, Fred Rich, he's an author whose writing, both fiction and nonfiction, probes contemporary political and moral issues from a fresh perspective. And that perspective is independent, nonpartisan, and pragmatic. Fred spent the first 35 years of his career as a prominent international lawyer. His switch to a writing career shocked the legal world, and his first book, Christian Nation, warned of the rise of so-called alt-right in partnership with theocratic fundamentalists. This critically acclaimed novel predicted the election of a demagogic populist as president, followed by a steady erosion of democratic norms. Rich, a lifelong environmentalist, has since turned his attention to environmental politics in his new book, Getting to Green, Saving Nature, a Bipartisan Solution. The book contains a rousing call for conservatives to reconnect with their long tradition of support for conservation and for the green movement to adopt the reforms necessary to restore bipartisan support for the environmental agenda. The Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution called it one of the most important environmental books of the year. The book has attracted widespread coverage, including a feature on PBS NewsHour. Before I hand it over to Lynn and Fred, a few quick webinar notes. If you're on Zoom, please share questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you have any technical problems during the presentation, please let us know in the chat box and our team will reach out to assist you. For the best view of the presentation, we recommend you go to the pull-down menu at the top center of your screen and choose Fit to Window. If you're watching from Facebook, you can submit questions via the comments. Thank you again for joining us today, and take it away, Lynn.
Really delighted to participate in this conversation with Fred, and thank you, Deb, to your entire Massachusetts team for this entire series. We embark on this climate solutions conversation during very troubled times. Deaths from the COVID-19 pandemic mount across the globe and in our own communities. The pandemic is affecting lives, it's affecting livelihoods. And we don't yet see clearly when and how we will emerge from the pandemic. And yet, at the same time, we face other planetary challenges that are acute and demand our attention. And among these, perhaps none is more urgent than climate change. The challenge is global, but it demands ambitious action in the United States. The US is the #2 highest greenhouse gas emitting country in the world after China. And it is also a place of remarkable innovation and entrepreneurship that can be further mobilized to contribute to a low carbon future. Like the rest of the world, communities, people, and places in the US are also experiencing the effects of a changing climate. The effects are unfolding now, and they will continue and grow more impactful. Ever more evident impacts are bringing some communities and economic sections to the table: coastal states, farmers, companies, and others. The good news is that despite federal inaction or even resistance by some, states, cities, communities, companies, farmers, and foresters are taking action. As all of us are aware, the climate policy context in the US has changed significantly during the current administration. The administration announced a withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. We see attempts to reduce relevant climate regulations, funding, and climate science in the United States. And these raise big questions in the US about leadership, the scope for US national action, our positioning on the issue by the private sector, market dynamics, state dynamics, and much more. These also, of course, raise questions about global action and global leadership. Yet, we are not at a standstill. Let me offer a couple of contextual comments. Progress on energy emission reductions in the United States power sector continues even without strong federal policy, though much more is needed. Many state policies support renewable energy, and those ambitions increase. Private sector innovation and customer demand for clean energy is growing, and indeed perhaps exponentially. We see innovations in battery storage, electric vehicles, energy efficient buildings, all emerging at an accelerating pace, though the pandemic, of course, has complicated those efforts. But there's much more to do, requiring durable policies that reinforce the drive towards a low carbon future. And durable action requires bipartisan engagement. This is not easy, but it is not impossible, and the Conservancy has a voice, experiences, and relationships to help build that engagement. The Conservancy, as many of you tuned in for this discussion know, has a strategic profile that's science-based, nonpartisan, collaborative, and with a solutions focus. We enjoy an extensive network of bipartisan supporters and relationships in all 50 states with over 1,300 trustees. They are farmers, they are shellfish growers, they are people in the corporate sector, and so many more. That profile gives us opportunities to enhance conversation about climate change and to advance solutions across the political divide in the US, while also engaging globally. So how are we doing this? Well, we've started with the narrative and tried to join others in reshaping that narrative, a narrative towards opportunity, innovation, entrepreneurship, and choice. Those are themes that resonate beyond political divides. I've watched the ebbs and flows of environmental discourse for over 35 years. I like to say maybe I started when I was 5 years old. Many of those current tensions and storylines are not new. Environment versus the economy, command and control versus markets, global action versus local. Despite those divisions, though, there's some good news. Beyond shrill headlines, we see that people overwhelmingly express support for environmental goals in general. And in the US, a recent bipartisan poll showed nearly 80% believe we can have a strong economy while protecting the environment. This presents foundations for a message around climate and the economy. But we need an echo chamber. We need to strengthen our voice by partnering with other influencers. And this includes state and local influencers who in turn create pressure points for federal action. So we're working closely with US governors as part of something called the US Climate Alliance, 25 or so states wedded to climate action. With the Environmental Defense Fund, a few years ago, we helped convene something we call our CEO Climate Dialogue. We now have over 20 members. These are global, large corporations, all putting their voice forward to seek for national climate action in the U.S. All support federal carbon pricing of some sort. And through the dialogue and other partnering, we're augmenting our engagement with states and on the Hill. So we actually, with others, helped build the House Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus from just an idea to dozens of members. And with others this past year, we helped in the creation of a Senate Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus. It now has over a dozen members. But achieving durable and ambitious solutions remains challenging. Robust solutions are difficult to secure when the political context is so divisive. And so a continuing challenge remains how to transcend those divisions. The states in the U.S. provide a rich context to advance messaging of economic opportunity, energy reliability, and consumer choice. So by working in all 50 states, the Conservancy is demonstrating the benefits of the transition to clean energy and building some bipartisan support for policies that benefit people, the economy, and the climate. We have three big climate goals. First, building on our legacy as a land conservation organization, we're seeking to advance what we call natural climate solutions, reforestation, improved forest management, soil health, and more. And the promising news is that natural climate solutions is gaining bipartisan traction. We're seeing deepening interest in the forestry sector, who begins to see itself as part of the solution. We see the agricultural sector. 10 years ago, they were actually a force against climate policy, but they're feeling the effects of climate change and seeing the role soil health may play as part of the solution. But changes in land management alone, of course, are not enough. And so a second part of our focus is in advancing the rapid shift to clean energy, both here in the US and across the globe, by helping to secure policy necessary to drive clean energy. But third, we're also helping communities to adapt to the effects of climate change, especially using nature solutions. As more people begin to see the effects of climate impacting their communities, they are beginning also to want to engage in solutions, not only to reduce those impacts, but also to find the big solutions of mitigating climate change. We're working with shellfish growers, for example, whose livelihoods are affected by climate change. We all know the context for climate and other environmental actions is complex, and there's a deep-rooted suspicion of science, of experts, certainly a suspicion of Washington. For some, the environment, especially global concerns like climate, have become sort of code words for big government or big costs in what I sometimes call the politics of symbols. There are, of course, relevant concerns here. Costs do matter, and too much red tape matters also. But the politics of symbols stands in the way for a search for solutions. And so it's that very complexity that demands dialogue and an exploration of solutions by engaging many voices. And I'm incredibly inspired by the work that the Conservancy's West Virginia chapter is doing. They are there in coal country, but they're working with Democrats and Republicans. They're working with the coal industry, with solar entrepreneurs, with forest owners, with outdoor recreation entrepreneurs, with state and local legislators. They convened 2 summits. They called it a Nature and Economy Summit. They asked, what does the future of West Virginia look like? And they're now exploring a fantastic real on-the-ground project on reclaimed mine lands to advance forestry, agricultural, and solar energy opportunities consistent with the low-carbon future. So efforts like that help pivot away from debate and toward a shared future. One of my favorite authors is William Isaacs. He wrote a book called Dialogue, and in it quipped that to listen is to develop an inner silence. I think maybe that's a variation on the words of George Bernard Shaw. He once explained that, and I quote, "The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place." So deep listening will help us all understand the values behind the words and symbols and reactions, and helps us explore pathways to common ground. Not always, and not with everyone, but more often. So let me return full cycle as I close back to my opening observation. Despite the U.S. politics of symbols, most people in the U.S. and around the globe support environmental protection, and increasingly the majority supports climate action. Most want an agenda of solutions. There is opportunity in the politics of solution, and that's our focus as conservatives. This also underscores the imperative of collaboration, dialogue, and building of a shared vision with extensive and diverse communities, engaging everyone. Collaborative engagement establishes, I think, the building blocks for the politics of problem solving, and that's a better place to be. It's essential as a step towards durable success. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. Why don't we move to Fred now, and then we'll come back at the end and ask him.
Thanks, Deb. Lynn, that was terrific. And there's so many things you mentioned that I'd love to talk about, like natural climate solutions and others. So let me just start in this 10 minutes, though, to give everybody a brief overview of Getting to Green, what my premise was and what the thesis of the book is, and then hopefully we can weave it into a discussion and involve the audience. The basic premise of Getting to Green was pretty simple, which is that we have a terrific grip on what our environmental problems are, climate change and loss of biodiversity in particular, and that we also have a pretty clear understanding of what we need to do to solve them. Where I saw our failure is in taking the necessary actions, especially in relation to climate change, especially at the federal level. So as an environmentalist, I thought the most critical question that wasn't being addressed enough is why? Why is this? Why do we understand the problems, we understand the solutions, but we fail to act, and what can be done about it? And that's the subject of the book. And in a nutshell, the answer in the book is that we need to restore enough conservatives to their historical role in the green movement, at least at a national level, so that we can make some progress on a bipartisan basis. And let me explain why. I wrote this book largely toward the end of the Obama administration, when there was a lot of optimism in our movement that, we had the appearance of progress. Think about what we had seen. The Keystone Pipeline had been defeated. The Paris Agreement was signed. The Obama administration had put forward the Clean Power Plan to help us reach our Paris targets. But in that moment, I really only saw the illusion of progress, because so many of these actions came through executive action. Particularly, I was concerned about the failure to seek ratification of the Paris Accords by the Senate. And as a student of history, I had learned that the only, what I had been calling sustainable progress, but Lynn, I like your word better. You said durable progress. That durable progress at the national level had only ever been made on a bipartisan basis. And that's why I was nervous. And, I'm very, very sorry to say that, I was right, because what happened? We had a change in the power structure. And under the current administration, every single one of the climate-related and other achievements under Obama have been reversed. And it's gone much further than this. We've seen an attempt to undermine the entire federal framework for environmental action, which has been in place, ironically, since Richard Nixon, and every single Republican in the Senate voted to put that framework into place. So we're not in a good place politically. According to Pew polling, environment is one of the two things on which Republicans and Democrats disagree the most. It's an astonishing poll result. They disagree about environment more than they disagree about taxes, labor, religiosity, immigration, right? This is not a good place. So unless we fix this, in my view, there's no moving forward. So how do we fix it? We need to peel away enough conservatives and moderates and Republicans to restore a working bipartisan consensus. This doesn't mean everybody. It doesn't mean, the 30% on the hard right. We can form a working bipartisan consensus with less than that. But there's another side of the coin which is equally important, which is that the green movement has to itself become a place that is welcoming to moderates and conservatives again. So this raises two questions that everybody asks is it possible? And if so, how to do it? Now, look, before 2016, I had a thesis on why it was possible. But let me just be frank with everybody. When the nation is, and the GOP in particular, is in the grip of Trumpism, no, it's not possible. I'm just going to put that aside. We're looking forward. We're looking forward beyond that time when the populist fever has abated. And there are three reasons why I think it is possible. First of all, it's necessary. All the leaders of the right had concluded before Trump that the only way they could continue to successfully contest national elections in the future was by discarding climate denialism. Karl Rove believed this. Karl Rove believed it, for 2 cycles in a row, and they're right. So the first reason for optimism is they have to do this in order to be successful on the national level. The second reason to believe it's possible is that this anti-environmentalism has only been in place since 1994. I did a 5-week book tour with a lot of college campuses. People would look blank. They didn't know the history. They assumed that, Republicans had been against the environment, for 100 years. It's completely untrue. So the current situation is an anomaly, both in terms of the tradition and in terms of ideals. And we're going to talk about what kind of values the right and the left share that really should bring us together on conservation. And by the way, what we hear in the press, especially from the far right, hides the fact that many rank and file conservatives and moderates still have not abandoned their support for the stewardship of nature. Deb, you probably know the same statistic for TNC, but in terms of Audubon, 40% of National Audubon's members self-identify as Republican and conservative, 40%. And I asked the president of Audubon the other day, I said, when you realigned your entire strategic plan around climate change, which, as you know, they did. They've been through 2 cycles now on their strategic plan. I said, how many members did you lose? He said, very, very few. This tells us something. The third reason to think change is possible is because of the nature of political change in America. It tends to happen in seismic shifts. And the best illustration of this is what happened on marriage equality. Think back to 2010. The whole idea that we could do marriage equality on a national level seemed like a completely impractical and distant dream. Only 2 years later, in 2012, we had reached a tipping point, and it happened. Many of the GOP senators I've spoken to think that they cite marriage equality as an example of how the political dynamic could change so very quickly when it comes to climate change. So it is conceivable, but if it's conceivable, then the second and the last question is, okay, how do we go about doing it? And the core insight that I want everybody to think about as we have this discussion is that the views on the right, on the hard right, that about climate change are what political scientists called sticky. And a sticky view in political science means that the political position is not derived from fact or reason, but it's really flipped over to be a marker of identity. And once they flip over into that, they're very, very hard to change. And I hope that many people on this call and on Facebook have read John Haidt and Dan Kahneman. And there's terrific scholarship and learning about where our political views come from. They really come from our moral views. You probably know the expressions motivated reason or cultural cognition. These are the things that help explain blindness to facts. And anybody who is engaged in client communication has to understand this. It really has 2 implications for how we affect the change that Lynn sees already happening and I see is inevitable. One is that when you have these sticky views, leadership for change has to come from within the community of belief, or at least it's much more effective when it comes from within the community of belief. I don't believe in, God love Al Gore and I love his PowerPoint slide, but I would assert there are very, very few Republicans and conservatives who have been persuaded by it. But take the Pope's encyclical a couple years ago on climate change. A lot of people listen to that in a way that they weren't listening to Al Gore. Or the best example, which I love, is Bob Inglis, who I'm sure all of you know, the extremely conservative evangelical Tea Party South Carolina congressman who went to Antarctica, saw the light on climate change, and came back, and even though, of course, he was primaried from the right and lost his seat, he is still going all around to Christian colleges throughout the South, telling the story from from his perspective, and he is changing hearts and minds. The last thing I'm going to say, because I think it's a good segue into, Deb, what a lot of what you want to talk about, is the second thing that this all teaches is how we talk about climate change when we engage with people. And I know that TNC has done this marvelous thing called the Let's Talk Climate initiative. And I was looking at that, and just to review for everybody, there are 4 things that advocates. Meet people where they are, connection outweighs facts, the goal is conversation, not conquest, and focus on the person across from you. And Lynn, it's a lot of what you were getting to when you were talking about listening. But here's the piece that I think we all have to focus on. It is a moral issue, not just a scientific one. TNC and the rest of us in the movement, we love science. It's our rock, it's our base, it's our foundation, right? And we talk a lot about science. We have to learn to do better, to talk about it as a moral issue, that it's the right thing to do. We have to talk about our values, and we have to make it personal, because the personal is what so often transcends the political. And I just leave you with one thing. If you really want to see what that kind of talk looks like, go online and look at Bob Inglis's acceptance speech. He was given the Profiles in Courage Award at the Kennedy Library right there up in Boston. And it was one of those beautiful American moments when this Tea Party evangelical was in the heart of Northeastern liberalism and the Kennedys, and he talked about climate change and in language that will illustrate what I'm talking about. So let's leave it there, and we can return to all this during the discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Fred. I think that was a wonderful description of where we are today. And one of the things I liked about your book and what you're talking about is it's very optimistic. It shares my optimism. I believe that as we look ahead over the next 10 years, that we will be able to make meaningful inroads when it comes to tackling climate change. And I'm wondering, Lynn, if you share that feeling, and if so, taking, some of what Fred said, what do you think are the most critical climate action steps we need to take right now to get ahead of this crisis and to take advantage of this stickiness idea?
At one level, I'm an inveterate optimist. I think during my years at the Interior Department, I was known as the Pollyanna, or the person always looking through the rosy colored glasses. And yet, I'm also a realist. And so I do look out there and I do see sobering reality. I do see the challenges that Fred spoke about. We've been at our efforts to drive climate action for a number of years now, and it's slow, and it reminds us this is hard. But yes, in general, I do share optimism. What I see is that sometimes that optimism depends on what you look at. And so if I look nationally on the Hill, notwithstanding a few conservatives that have come into the mix on the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus, for example, nonetheless, it looks rather discouraging, certainly at this point. If I look out across the countryside and in the states where we're working with the shellfish growers, we started with 1 or 2 shellfish growers. We now have over 100 as part of a coalition. Talk about authentic voices, Fred, to build upon a concept that you had. They speak to the entire food industry. So here's why this matters. Or I go out and I look at individual communities, the forestry sector. We work a lot with the forestry sector, and they're standing up and saying, wow, I guess we can be part of the solution. So I see a lot of opportunity there, because reforestation, improved forest management, those lie at the heart, not of all the things we need to do, but of much we need to do. and working with those people who, again, span the political spectrum, gives a voice and a pathway for action now, while we still hope to drive big action strategies.
That's very interesting. So, you know, as the new state director, I've been doing a listening tour and speaking to people in politics, people, who have been supporters, stakeholders. And I always hear that the value that TNC brings is that we are nonpartisan and that we bring people together across the party lines around our issues. And I guess, Fred, I just love in your book how you talk about the center green, that place where liberals and conservatives have overlapping values on the environment. And, you know, from your book and your talk, it's obvious that that's that starting point that you see. What can you give me some advice as a new director, and maybe Lynn, you know, from her position with World Office, how can groups like the Nature Conservancy better appeal to those values and take folks to the next level of action?
Well, I think you put your finger on something, Deb, which is we have to separate out communication from action. I believe that the way we talk about these issues is hugely important, but I equally think we can't just say that the solution is messaging. The solution is not just messaging. I mean, and let me just go back to one thing before I turn to that, because you and Lynn were talking about optimism and versus pessimism, and I'll tell you how I've been reconciling that when I speak to different audiences. We have to be careful that our optimism isn't itself a type of denialism. I'm very sorry. My generation has failed the next generation. We have. Unless some bioengineering technologies come along, they are going to suffer from increased temperatures. They're going to suffer from sea level rise. There's going to be a huge amount of suffering in the world that goes along with that. And that's on us, I think. So I don't think that's a matter of optimism versus pessimism. Unfortunately, that's a matter of realism. But the choice we now face is, can we keep things from going from bad to worse? And that is a choice worth making, because worse in this case is a truly existential threat. So let's not be, Cassandra's let's just acknowledge where we are, especially acknowledge that we've screwed up and failed. After all, the environmental movement started working on this in 1980. Jim, Hansen sounded the alarm. It's been our number one thing. And since, how many years is that? 40 years. And yet carbon just keeps going up and up and up, except for the most recent period. So I think admitting that failure is important. And let's face it also, it was a largely political failure. So let me say two things then about, you said, what are the things we have in common? So let's talk about personal values, and then let's talk about political values very briefly. I mean, personal values, the right and the left have a tremendous amount in common. Inglis, if you read his speech, he talks about courage, love, wisdom, compassion, right? These are very, very powerful ideas, and nobody on the right or the left has a monopoly on any of these. And if you just think about it for 1 second, right? Is there any world in which willful blindness to climate change, or failure to act because it's too hard or too expensive, is consistent with those values? There's no value system in existence under which we're entitled to make a quick buck today at the expense of our grandchildren. So yes, and the other thing that is a great value of particular interest to the right is personal responsibility. And it's one of the best things about Inglis. When he came back, he said, my values as a conservative and a Christian, seeing what I just learned in Antarctica, they compel me to act. It's personal. I don't care if it's impossible. I don't care if I get primaried from the right. I don't care if I lose my seat in Congress, right? Because I believe in the ethic of personal responsibility, and this is what I have to do. Redefining things in terms of equity and fairness. If we look at the lessons of marriage equality, we didn't get very far when we were talking about that in terms of rights. And the minute we started talking about fairness, that's a deeply held American value. People responded to that instantly. Well, what we're doing in ignoring climate change, this is not fair. It's not fair to people who are the most vulnerable in our country today. It's certainly not fair to the most vulnerable around the world. It's not fair to future generations. We have to talk about that. On the political side, let me just say two things. If you look at some of the great bipartisan victories, let's remember it was George H.W. who solved acid rain in a bipartisan way. It was Ronald Reagan who got together with Margaret Thatcher, to solve the hole in the ozone layer. How did they come together? Because the left accepted sort of free market solutions. This was how cap and trade started. Look at today. Every former GOP Secretary of the Treasury agrees that we need to have a market price for carbon. Right? So there are a lot of sort of political, ideological points where we can come together. And the last one I would mention is framing things in terms of risk. When we have this stupid dumbed down dialogue where, it's either going to be the apocalypse or everything's going to be okay. Of course, when you read Reagan's speeches about the ozone, and he met some opposition from within his own party. He said, well, I look at this in terms of risk. I don't think my house is going to burn down, but there's a chance it'll burn down. And so then I look at how expensive the insurance is. And this is how the corporate world does things. And one of the, I forget, Lynn, whether you mentioned this in your remarks, but there's a report that was put together called Risky Business that Bloomberg and I forget, a whole bunch of sort of corporate moderate types, and they reframed the whole climate change in terms of risk analysis and sort of threw it to the corporate sector. And by the way, as Lynn did say, the corporate sector has taken that on board and has internalized it and is actually spending money on mitigation. So there are some political and ideological principles that can bring us together as well. And hope is more powerful than despair. This is the other thing. I've been an environmentalist for 35 years, and much of that time, we were trying to sell the apocalypse. And there's a commentator, I'm forgetting exactly who it was now, but he said, Martin Luther King stood up in 1963 and said, I had a dream. And 40 years later, we had an African-American president. The environmental community got up in 1963 and said, we have a nightmare. And we've got to sell the dream. We've got to show how the world that we envision looks like, right? So I think these are some of the ingredients that we have to deploy.
Well, that's really helpful, Fred. Thank you. Let me just remind our audience, as you think of a question for Lynn and Fred, please share them in the Zoom Q&A box at the bottom of your screen or via the Facebook comments, and we'll get to them. I just want to see if Lynn could respond here. So Lynn, one of the ways I know you for many years is your work on science communication. We both spoke at different events talking about how to help scientists, talk about policy and be accessible. And do you think this is a problem about communication and that we're just not talking about climate change in a way that's accessible? I think that's a bit of what Fred is saying, is that part of the disconnect is that we as in the environmental movement are talking in ways that are just not accessible to people who don't ordinarily consider themselves environmentalists.
Yeah, in many ways, I think Fred touched upon really the most important considerations. So many scientists on climate have thought that their primary challenge was one of translation. That is, oh my goodness, complex words, complex analyses, how can we translate it in ways that will then resonate? And yet, we find through behavioral science and other examination of how people think and why do they think what they think, that isn't the core problem. Now, to be sure, scientists can do better and can strive to straight talk, if you will. But that isn't the core challenge in motivating people to stand up and defend on climate change. I think Fred really zeroed in on a couple of very important things. So how does how does one talk about core values that we all share and link those to the climate change? So if you think about climate change and you think about the effects of a changing climate, it is affecting and may result in the disappearance of some whole communities. That matters a lot to mothers, fathers, their children, the prospect of their grandchildren. And so talking about climate in ways that really resonate with the value sets that people hold near and dear is really. I think also, though, we do at the Conservancy emphasize the importance of solutions. This is not something Fred talked about. We find a lot more resonance when we pivot away from, oh my goodness, there's a huge challenge here. What do we do about it? To actually working with those voices, working with those farmers, working with folks in the communities, as in West Virginia, and offer some solutions that are going to give economic vitality, help address the climate, because then they can galvanize around doing. And so I think it's more than just a science communication challenge.
Yeah. Thank you. We have a question about, Fred, I think it's kind of jumping off on a comment that you made. So is your recommendation that those of us in the movement, the environmental movement, stop using climate change denier as a synonym for conservative? In other words, this person says, is it incumbent upon environmental progressives to take the first step in reframing things?
You know, that's a terrific question. I want to break it into two parts. Taking the first step, absolutely. I mean, we're the ones who get it. We're the ones who care. And our responsibility is to do what's necessary and to focus on the Koch brothers and blame and the lies and the this and, yes, that's the history, but we have to take the first steps. I love the way you put that. So my answer to that is an unequivocal yes. I also think that using the term denier is not helpful because of the Holocaust echoes. It is too emotive. Now, look, is it deserved in the case of some people, i.e. the people who constructed this strategy? And by the way, my research shows it was a top-down strategy, not a bottoms-up strategy. I'm not worried about offending those people. They deserve to be offended. I'm sorry, that's my view. But the rank and file who came under this influence, they do not deserve to be labeled as deniers, even though they happen to hold that belief because of a broader identity. So yes, and by the way, remember one of the TNC 4 principles, you don't hit this head on. They don't have to surrender. You don't have to get people to say they were wrong. Here in the Hudson Valley, we found something very interesting. We had 2 500-year storms in 2 years. Everyone was coping with sea level rise up and down the river in the harbor. All of a sudden, the question of whether climate change and sea level rise was real, we didn't even have to talk about that. The conversation, we leapt over that barrier into what do we do about it? How can we mitigate it and make sure it doesn't get worse? How can we adapt? And that was a conversation that many people from the right who only 2 years earlier, were clearly in the, it's a hoax camp, were engaging in those conversations. So yes, I agree with the premise behind that question.
So in other words, never always take advantage of the crisis if you can, because it makes the connection, right?
To what Fred said. So, in our Let's Talk Climate, we have those four principles, if you will, and one of them is communication, not conquest. And, conquest, you start with the idea, that person is wrong and you're right, and by golly, you're going to bring them to your side. That is not, think of the term fairness, that is sort of not a fair starting point, a point where you're respecting and trying to listen and learn. That William Isaac's comment, to listen is to develop it in the silence. The second point I want to make swings from a noted conservative economist, F.A. Hayek. Years ago, talking about various political debates, he once made the comment that going to somebody and saying, "You're wrong, think like me," is a little bit like going to them and saying, "Empty your bank account and give me all your money."
Right.
Because their thinking is thinking that is formulated culturally and over time and with friends of experience, that cultural cognition that Fred described. And so a starting point to have a real dialogue and find that search for solutions is to be respectful of the shared values and then explore where those lead to.
That is
and can I just add something to what Lynn said, because I think it's so important, that there's a way to do that, which is that, you know, the question of whether climate change is real and whether it, you know, is in part caused by human beings, we think is a question on which reasonable people can't differ. But it's very helpful to engage on questions where reasonable people can differ, right? And what is the correct policy response, right? How much money should we spend, right? That's something that it's not that I'm absolutely right and you're absolutely wrong. You know, should it be a tax? Should we have cap and trade? Should we have cap and dividend? Well, you know, how much do we really need to, how fast do we need to go to renewables? These are all questions on which people can differ. And so once you start that discussion, then it's what an old-fashioned real political discussion used to be. We can each bring our ideological preferences, you know, regulation versus private sector. We can bring those to the table. We can engage. And now what are we doing? We're talking about a problem which we both acknowledge is a problem, looking for solutions. And that's, if we can get the politics there, we can get it done, because that's what the politics looked like in the 70s and the early 80s.
So there were two comments that were similar that just fit in with this really well. One is, you know, believing that emphasizing the economic advantages from moving, you know, away from fossil fuel. A fossil fuel economy may be a way to find an overlap, and the economic impacts of climate right now as well may be that place of connection. But then there was a more sort of a starker question, which is that, you know, there is a reality that many conservative office holders or aspiring office holders are threatened by being primaried by the right, which we did see in your example. And, you know, and then, you know, of course, you've got Fox News and other media outlets who are pushing a narrative that is that really is hostile to both the concepts and also the solutions around climate change. Is there a way to go beyond this in your view, Fred? Have you seen it?
Well, remember what I said. I said that under the current, when the Republican movement is in the grip of, you know, a demagogic populism, it's not going to happen. It's just not. I don't think this sort of bipartisan story is one that can play out in the present circumstances. But if you posit a change in, you know, in political power and a loss that causes the, you know, we need a center-right party in this country. If we're going to have a two-party democracy, we need a center-right party. And there will be a huge debate as to how the GOP reconstitutes itself, you know, when it's really left in ashes, which I'm sorry to say I think it will be by by Trumpism. So there'll be a lively debate as to how to reinvent the GOP. All I can say is that a lot of the, you know, pros in the room have an image that because this is an issue on which the people will demand political leadership, that they have to get out in front of it. And they have to do so in a way that's faithful to their values. And we've seen, you know, when a bunch of Republican senators put out a kind of GOP version in response to the Green New Deal. It wasn't, you know, quite so regulatory. And but let me say one other thing that why I think in a post-Trumpist world, when the nation is so divided, and the nation was equally divided during the Nixon administration because of the civil rights movement and Vietnam. I mean, it was a grim, grim picture, similar to what we face now. Nixon, interestingly, thought that environment could play a role in healing those divisions. And in fact, they did. And it was one of the reasons that he tactically wanted the Republicans not to cede the field to the Democrats. I think that Biden and leadership on the right and left is going to see that reframing environment in terms of public health is going to be something that can bring us together. And I think our political leaders will see merit in that. I think they'll see a thirst for things that can bring us together, and it's very accurate to look at it in terms of public health. And as Lynn said, it's got to be about people, not just about nature. And there are very few things that people care about more than their own health and the health of their children. And so I think that is one scenario that could play out.
Deb, let me offer a slightly different reframed response to that. Again, I'll go back to the phrase I used, you see what you look at. So on the one hand, Fred is absolutely right. If we're looking at the prospects of big national climate action next week or in this administration, clearly that's out of reach right now. However, we are actually already seeing some of those conservatives and Republicans coming into the mix. So when we started working on the House Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus, it had a total of 0 people. We ultimately got it up to 90. Now, some of them lost, but there's still a good 50 or so that are participants, half of whom are Republicans. And they're looking for solutions because many of them are in coastal states. They know their constituencies care a lot. They've got to find some action and a voice on the matter. Now we have the Bipartisan Senate Caucus. But just the other day, Senator Braun, Republican, Senator Stabenow, Democrat, have put forth something they call Growing Climate Solutions. And it is centered on the role of nature to provide climate solutions, whether in forestry, whether in agriculture. This is important to Republicans and conservatives because a lot of them have those farmers, those foresters as constituencies in the middle part of the country. So there is action now where some Republicans and conservatives are finding their way into this discussion, whether in the spirit of Rob Inglis and a sense of responsibility, or whether they see their constituencies moving in that direction and they need to have something to say. So it's happening now. We don't need to just hold our breath and wait.
I mean, Lynn, a great example of that is last week with the Land and Water Conservation Fund being made permanent, and that those constituencies really have always been in the conservation camp, right? And so extending that through natural climate solutions into the climate world, I think is already happening. I completely agree with Lynn. It's already happening. And I hope we all, including TNC, put a lot more money behind natural climate solutions because it can drive, if we can have moments of bipartisan consensus, they help build a scaffolding on which the bigger thing can be built. And God knows Lynn is right at the local level. I mean, if you're in a coastal city with sea level rise, there's no such thing as a Republican or a Democrat, mayor. I mean, they are all grappling with the reality of that. And yes, so
Fred, one of the things I really knew as somebody who'd been the secretary of a state natural resources agency and responding to natural disasters, that climate change is a completely bipartisan issue on the ground. And so Lynn, I know, as you said, a lot of the action and the innovation is happening locally in cities and towns, in states. And that is where you can build, I think, a bipartisan support. And I also really appreciate, Fred, your point that it is about people ultimately. And it's about appealing to values. And I just want to thank you both for such a great discussion. We're approaching the end of our time today. And we've got, I guess, about a minute or so for each of you if you've got some final remarks. And why don't we start with Lynn and then we'll finish up with Fred. And I want to also make sure that you let people know where to find your book, Fred, when it comes to your time. So Lynn. Any final thoughts?
Thank you so much for hosting this conversation. I guess the final thought I will leave people with is we must act because this is an existential challenge, and we can act, and we don't need to wait. There are things we can do in the meanwhile while we wait for the big action and the big push.
Great, thank you. And Fred?
Well, since you invited me to plug my book, here it is. It's available everywhere that books are sold, so thank you for that. I just want to also thank, I understand that a number of people who are on this Zoom and call are supporters of TNC in Massachusetts, and I want to thank you for that. TNC does such wonderful work, and it can't do it without you, so thank all of you for that. And I would just leave with one thought. We didn't talk about the energy of the youth and the need to reconstitute a popular movement here. 20 million Americans turned out on the streets on Earth Day in 1970. 20 million. We've never recovered the energy and optimism of that moment. And ultimately, we're a democracy, and ultimately, that's what our political system responds to. And so for those on this call who are in college or post-college, we need your activism, we need your energy, we need to be a movement that people listen to just as they did in 1970. And if they do, we can solve this problem.
Thank you. That's a great way to wrap this up. I want to thank both of you for joining us today, and thank you to everyone who tuned in. We appreciate your support of the Nature Conservancy. Your support makes all of this work possible. We're going to be sending everyone a follow-up email over the coming days with a link to the resources we talked about today and recording of this webinar. Feel free to share it with friends. You can also find the full webinar schedule and other past recordings at nature.org. MA webinars. You can also follow us on social media at conserve_MA on Facebook and Instagram to keep up with our work and get updates on upcoming virtual opportunities to connect with our staff. And join us for next week's webinar on Thursday, August 13th. We'll be joined by Andrew Tingley and Tom Hodgson of NatureVest, TNC's conservation investing unit that seeks to transform the way we protect nature. We'll be sending invitations out soon, and you can always register at nature.org /MA webinars. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great afternoon. Thanks again to our great speakers. Bye now.
Bye.